Welcome everyone. This is Professor Jordan Fisher, and we're in our third and final module of this Introduction to Risk Management. Today, we're going to be talking all about risk assessment and risk analysis. So we're going to talk through what the risk assessment workflow looks like. We're going to look at some tools and techniques that can be used to conduct these risk assessments. We're going to discuss risk classification, which is really key when you're starting to identify risks to assess. And then we're going to talk briefly about risk measurement and evaluation, which is probably one of the most challenging aspects of risk assessment. So what does that risk assessment workflow look like? And here we have a diagram that really walks you through all of the core components of a risk assessment. So the first step is identifying risk and defining that risk. And that's really been a foundational principle that we've talked through in all of these risk management modules. The second is rating the risks and ranking against risk criteria. So what are the risk criteria that you're going to be using to rate or look at these risks? The third is responding to risks. So how are you going to respond to them? What are the solutions that you're going to develop to address those risks? And as part of that, the fourth step is what are the controls that you're going to put in place to mitigate those risks and manage it? And then finally, a theme that we really talked a lot about in Module 2, how are we going to report, review, and monitor those risks? Because we really need to understand how are we going to address risk and keep an ongoing understanding of those metrics to have that reporting back. It's really important that in all of this assessment, you really incorporate both experience feedback. So how are you experiencing risk? What are you seeing from an organizational level? And then also ensuring that you have that information feedback. So it's that feedback loop that really is going to create the ability to ongoing assess these risks as you go through. So some tools and techniques that you should be incorporating within your risk assessment. So the first is creating questionnaires and checklists. So questionnaires can be used to interview key stakeholders, departments, business units, silos, being able to cross over those silos by talking to a variety of different stakeholders. So these really should be questionnaires and checklists that are geared towards asking concrete questions around risk. And you really want to be thinking about how can I frame this in a way that's concrete and not abstract. So asking a stakeholder, how are you handling this risk, is really not going to help them to identify the ways that they're doing it. But really taking that problem, taking that risk that you've identified and breaking it down to its core component aspects is going to help to develop really impactful questionnaires and checklists that you can use in assessing the risk. Creating workshop and brainstorming sessions with these key stakeholders is really key. Get those people talking. When they're talking, they're actually going to do more than you would ever think in assessing their own risks, their own ways of approaching it, and really helping you to flesh out and design those solutions. Creating the ability to inspect and audit, and sometimes this is done by a third party in order to create that independence, but as part of that, you really need to have a good understanding of risk and assessing what it's doing. And then finally, put this into a flow chart. Make this something that can be viewed visually that's going to help organizations understand how risk is flowing throughout all of the different things that are being done. Again, creating that interrelationships, that interconnectivity of risk. It is very rare that risk will be siloed and only impact one aspect of an organization or one project. And so you really need to be able to create that representative flow chart that's going to demonstrate how risk is flowing throughout the organization. Part of the tools and techniques that you should be using is really looking at a risk agenda. And a risk agenda is really a way to break down a specific area of risk and identify where is that risk coming from. So what is the risk source? Is it from strategic, tactical areas? Is it operational risk? Are there compliance risks? There's a variety of different risk sources, and the list could go on and on depending on the risk. What is the actual event? So the event could be we have a pandemic. The event could be we have a disease outbreak. What is the actual event that's going to trigger the risk? And then where is that risk coming from? Who is impacted by the event? So there should be so many different impacts of an event. There could be, and each that each impact could have a different likelihood. So the impact of a financial component could be different than a reputational component, a marketplace component. So you really want to lay down the specifics of what's being impacted. And you're not just going to list financial, you're going to list our marketplace ability to do X, right? So you want to really create those impacts and what those specific impacts are going to be. And this is really going to drive then how you're going to determine the likelihood and measure. So the more specific you can be in this risk agenda for your specific event, and the event is the risk, the more likely you're going to be able to create those quantifiable metrics that are going to really help you to monitor and create that feedback loop. When you're looking at assessing risk, it's really important that you classify that risk. And classifying it is really looking at what are the different ways of viewing this risk? Where does this risk sit in? And there's a variety of different categories you can use to classify risk. The first is political. Is this a political risk? Is there a political component to this risk? Meaning, is it geopolitical? If something were to happen politically, could it impact us? Really looking at what are the political ramifications of it. Is it economical? There's a lot of risks that aren't economical, but a fair number of them do have an economic impact. It could be on an individual level, it could be on an organizational level, it could be at a societal level, but do you have an economic impact of this risk? Sociological impact. So this is, again, looking at that societal impact of risk. Do you have the ability to classify this risk or a part of this risk as sociological? Technological. I think that almost every business, every organization, every person is in some way connected to the internet, is using technology to go about their life. And so I think it's going to be hard to argue there's not a technical risk to any area of business and organization, entities, society, government, etc. So you really would be incorporating what are the technological risks that are incorporated within this. Are there legal? This goes to compliance, this goes to contractual agreements. Do you have legal risk associated with this event? You have a lot of legal risks around things like data, HR relations, healthcare, and so you really need to be incorporating that when you're doing your risk assessment. And then finally, do you have ethical or environmental components to your risk? And how are we going to monitor those? How are we going to mitigate those? And again, some of these components might not necessarily be involved in every risk, but you should be taking a look at your problem, taking a look at your risks that you've identified and say, are there any of these components? And if there are, how are we going to measure them? How do we quantify the risk that is involved in each of these? You can also classify risk by its time frame. So you have short-term risk. So these are things that are going to immediately impact your organization. So a pandemic is a great example of where you could have that short-term risk because it's going to impact immediately, and it's not necessarily going to be something that you will have had bandwidth to address. So the disruption occurs at the time of the event. So if something happens, as soon as it happens, you're going to have a risk that's going to materialize. Medium-term risk are things that once the event happens, the risk actually might not be felt for a period of time. Usually when we're looking at medium risk, we quantify them as being within a year, so not immediate, but within a year. And also these risks tend to impact core processes of an organization. And then finally, you have long-term risks. So these are significantly delayed impacts. So we're looking at over a year impact, and they often have a strategic impact. And as you can imagine, by classifying these risks on this time frame, it's also going to help you to identify what are the risks that we need to prioritize now, and what is the impact of those risks. So you might say an event that happens today, if we don't feel the impact of that for over a year, and if you're a startup company, you might say that we're willing to take that risk because we don't even know if we're going to be in business in a year. But if you're a large enterprise, a year is a very short period of time. And so then that risk might feel more real and something that you want to mitigate, even though it's not going to happen for a year. So classifying your risk as short, medium, and long term is really key to helping to identify how you're going to address and design solutions around that risk. So finally, how do you measure risk and how do you create a risk rating? And to be completely candid, this is the most challenging aspect for risk management and risk assessment because measuring an abstract is very challenging. And there's going to be a lot of subjective thoughts and perspectives that go into these risk measurements. And as much as we're going to try to push the objective and really look to developing metrics and solutions that don't bring in the subjective, it's impossible to do so, because every time you're talking about risk, you're talking about trade-offs, and you're talking about creating the solutions that are going to work for your organization. And the way you're going to look at risk is very different than the way someone else is going to look at risk. So the challenges to measuring risk is really balancing that objective versus subjective. So how do we incorporate the fact that I'm going to have a certain perspective, but I need to minimize that in order to, as most as possible, objectively look at risk? How are we going to quantify risk? And a lot of this is going to come down to a statistical issue. So how do we create a statistical analysis around that risk to say, what is the probability or the likelihood of that risk occurring? And that's really where we're going to sit for most of our risk measurements. And this is a very simplified risk matrix that you can use to start to quantify that risk. So you can say you want to look at magnitude of that risk and the likelihood. So the magnitude is really how impactful is that risk going to be. A high magnitude risk means it's going to impact us greatly. A low magnitude means it's going to have a lower impact on us as an organization. And then you want to look at what is the likelihood of that risk. So if it's a high likelihood and high magnitude, that means it's going to have a really high impact on us, and it's most likely going to happen. Versus a high likelihood and a low magnitude means that it's going to most likely happen, but if it happens, it's going to have a low impact on us. And so this is a very simplified risk matrix. You can get much more complicated with these risk matrices. You can have varying levels and gradients within here. But the key thing is to say, where do we as an organization want to sit? Are we okay with high likelihood and low magnitude risks? Are we okay only with low likelihood, low magnitude risks? Where do we sit within this matrix? Because that's going to really help to say, where do we want our risk to sit? And then when we're looking at a risk, we can say, is it high likelihood, high magnitude? If that's the case, then how do we bring it to low magnitude? Can we remove some of the impacts of it? Can we redesign our organization to remove that? How do we bring it to low likelihood? Maybe that means that we remove data from our systems. Maybe that means that we more securely address different areas. And so you really want to be looking at the various components of risk, the political, economical, sociological, technical, all of those components that we talked about, and say, does this component exist for this risk? If it does, where does it sit on this risk matrix? And then how do we quantify all of that so that we can monitor it and mitigate it as we need to? So this is a general overview of the risk assessment process, and it's very abstract when you look at it in this context. But the real key is to take a problem and to break it down into its component parts. The first question is, what risks do I have? And then the question becomes, of those risks, what components go into each of them? How am I going to create that risk agenda? What are the risk sources? What is the impact of this risk? And then how am I going to measure that risk? Where does it sit within this risk matrix so that I can say, am I okay with this risk? Am I not okay with this risk? And if you're not okay, how are you going to mitigate it? How do you design solutions to mitigate risk? And that's really where you're going to delve into it with problem sets and really looking at real life solutions that are going on. So we're going to be talking about this in more detail as we go through the problems. But as always, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.